Welcome to the Doom Scroll News Report here on Radio Taiwan International, where I, Hanna Belinsky, and my co-host,
Amanda Stevens,
two writers, political by necessity, cover some of the biggest international news stories dominating our news feeds from the last week. I'm Hanna Belinsky, and this week we're tackling the low birth rate, something that comes up in the newsroom with quite a bit of regularity, and about how different factors contribute to people's decisions to remain childless. I definitely see the topic come up a lot in my own doom scrolling, although I can't be sure whether that's algorithm related and the machine is pushing that to me deliberately, knowing I just had a baby. What I do know is it reliably gets clicks, and it's a topic that everyone seems to have an opinion on when it comes up.
Yeah, it's just occurred to me now as we're recording this that you and I kind of represent two opposite sides of this in terms of I never want to have kids.
Really? I didn't know that about you.
Yeah. But that's it. So I also get those stories, but I think for the opposite end of it. When I was living in the United States, part of it I felt was a little bit like propaganda as like a young woman.
No, I think it is kind of propaganda that they push to us.
Yeah, so I think it comes up to your point that we're always reading about it. There was a news story here in Taiwan just 2 days ago about how April saw the lowest births per month ever.
Yeah, I think it just keeps trending downward.
Well, and that's a global thing too, right?
Yes, so it is in most countries.
Yeah.
One of the last articles to catch my eye on this was actually about the teen birth rate. This was from ABC News by Mary Kakatos, which was reviewing a CDC report on how the teen birth rate fell to a record low. Birth rates for women all across age groups have fallen since 1991. But this particular statistic stood out to me because, according to the report, there was this slight increase in 2006 and 2007. And this just so happens to correspond to the time I was in high school. And it makes the fact that I graduated alongside about 10 teen moms in a class of only 100. It makes a lot more sense.
Wow. Yeah, that is like 10% of your class.
Yeah, it's 10%. Now, what's interesting is when I looked into the teen birth rate in Taiwan, I did find it to be one of the highest among East Asian countries. But per a research article I found published in 2022 that looked at pregnancy and abortion rates in Taiwan between 2006 and 2016, the vast majority, about 79% of pregnant teens get an abortion, whereas in the U.S., only about a third of all teenage pregnancies end in abortion. So needless to say, there are some major cultural differences at play here.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, too, that you do see a lot of similarities between conservative values in Taiwan and in the United States, but they're rooted in different things.
Yeah,
and in the U.S., it's like rooted in Christianity. And in Taiwan, it's rooted in like Confucianism, but also more complex than that because Taiwan is a very blended society.
Yeah, I want to say shame is a huge factor in it on this side of the world. Although a lower incidence of accidental pregnancies in teenage girls is unequivocally a positive thing, or at least it is to anyone who isn't rabidly pro-natalist.
We're for it here.
Yeah.
We like that.
Governments in developed countries around the world have been enacting policies in an attempt to increase the birth rate. Per Vivian Hoang and Hanna Grabenstein reporting for PBS News, they're trying things like cash bonuses, better leave, affordable childcare, fertility treatment subsidies, but in the end, none of these policies have been particularly successful, in large part because for each country, some deeply ingrained social or cultural issue or issues that need addressing in a way that the kinds of policies they've tried just can't reach.
Yeah.
A bit of economic assistance is all well and good. Actually, prospective parents could use a lot more of it, but that's only a small piece of what goes into the decision to start a family.
Right. For myself and for other people I hear a lot, one of the things is like it's very expensive, but not financially, not exclusively financially, that is. When you have a child, even just one child, we're not even getting into 2 or 3, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of time. It's going to cost a lot of your energy, and it's going to cost you opportunities. Of course, you're going to be getting opportunities as well that you don't have when you're child free, right? And this isn't to say that it's like a net loss. I'm not trying to imply that at all.
No, I know exactly what you mean.
Comparing these two things, and that's a comparison that a lot of people make. One report that I was listening to from Crooked Media was talking about how in South Korea, for example, which has, I think infamously, one of the lowest birth rates. One big factor that women are not having children is because a wife and a mother is then thought of as being responsible for caring for the whole family.
Yes.
Her children, her family, and her husband's family. And that then becomes her responsibility, and she has to be earning 50% of the income. for that household as well.
How do you even do it?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can and be sane, right? This is the dark side of the Industrial Revolution where women were then encouraged to go have a job, make money. Now everybody wants you to make money and still fulfill the role of a housewife.
I'll be honest with you, like about 6 months in now with my son, I'm going crazy.
Yeah.
I feel like I am cognitively impaired.
Well,
like it's because
it's so much work.
Which is totally not good for my line of work, obviously. Some days I feel like I can barely string a sentence together, but that's just my reality now. You have to keep giving and giving. You're never not on. You never get a day off. You know, every spare minute besides going to work is spent with the baby.
Yeah.
I'm just emptied out every day. It's crazy.
Well, and I think that's it. I think that is the universal experience, even for people like yourself or even other people who would maybe this is their dream to have a kid. That doesn't make the experience easier because it's always going to be exhausting.
Well, this isn't my therapy session, but I'm glad you touched on some of these topics because our guest this week explains some of her findings in this regard. She touches on several of the things we just discussed in greater detail.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear it.
To help us cut through all of the clickbait and layman's commentary about why the birth rate is so low and get to the real data on what could be done to address it, we've invited postdoc fellow Dr.
PeiChieh
from Academia Sinica's Center for Survey Research on. Dr. Hsu has a scholarly background in sociology and gender studies, and she's looked into topics like marriage equality and women's rights in Taiwan, as well as assisted reproductive technologies and reproductive decision-making in Japan. Dr. Hsu, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm pretty excited to have the opportunity to pick your brain because this is the kind of thing I would have liked to study if I had had what it took to be a career academic.
Hi, thanks for this opportunity to talk about this issue, but I know that this issue is super complicated, and I hope some of my knowledge can contribute to this whole discussion.
I'm sure it will. So the reason I wanted to bring you in is because in the newsroom, we find ourselves regularly reporting on Taiwan's low birth rate, or the low birth rate of our neighbors like Japan and South Korea. And as often as we cover this topic, we seldom see a reason given for why a declining birth rate is actually a problem to countries such as Japan and Taiwan. Could you briefly describe the reasons why low birth rate is considered problematic to begin with?
As my research interests also concerns about the family relationship and the gender relationships within the family, I would like to approach this question from the first angle is that low birth rate might, in the long term, might contribute to a super aged society. So older care issue can be more prominent if we don't have enough young adults to support the society. And because you couldn't really estimate how long a older person might need care, the time frame is they can hardly predict that.
Right.
So if this time prolonged longer than we expected, it would cause some issue to the whole society, like economic issue and the whole care system plan issue. And also the other angle many people talk about is its impact on economic. Because we don't have enough labor force. If younger generation is shrinking, then we don't have enough labor force to support the whole society, the economic development.
Right.
The other reason is some would argue that it will decrease the social innovation because they believe that younger generation, they have more potential or mobility or motivation to embark.
Come up with new ideas?
Yes.
To innovate.
So innovation might also link to age.
It makes sense because, there is that saying in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And if you're of a certain generation, you can't always stay perfectly up to date. It's not really possible. So you can't come up with new things that are going to be relevant to right now.
Yeah, and some research did show that those who apply for new project or start some startup companies, they are those who are younger. I think currently for politicians or lawmakers, especially in Taiwan, I think the critical issue is about aging society.
Okay,
Right.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
What we normally publish in the news is the superficial data, which I think is pretty unsatisfying given it is a really complex issue, like you said, and there are so many different contributing factors. And we, being reporters, we don't have the expertise to determine which factors we should highlight. So based on your research, are there any shared factors, for example, between Taiwan, Korea, and Japan that contribute to the low birth rate in East Asia overall?
The first thing I would like to bring up here is the cultural trend or the traditional beliefs on familialism. We said it's more like the whole society value family as a basic unit of our society.
Yes.
So that supports the whole social system.
Right.
So this belief on familialism, I think this idea well intertwined with the advancement of the society's belief on gender equality, so that this collision will contribute to low birth rate,
I see.
because the belief on family sometimes wouldn't align with people's belief on their own self, like individualism, the development of themselves. And I think the other factor that is shared among East Asian societies, that the link between marriage and child rearing is still very, very strong.
Yeah, it's unusual to see someone, at least here in Taiwan, give birth out of wedlock.
Yeah, the percentage is very low. It's around 3 to 4% in Taiwan.
Okay.
And in Japan, it's about 2%.
Wow.
So even lower. So it's a consistent trend. It doesn't really increase across the time. The rate of unmarried women in Taiwan is increasing.
I see.
So we see the link here.
Yeah,
is
that's related.
the part.
Right. It's interesting because coming from the United States, it's very common actually for someone to give birth out of wedlock. It's almost, I don't want to say normalized, but it definitely happens with reasonable frequency.
Or it's more accepted.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. In general, it's not really a big deal, culturally speaking.
Or in Taiwan, I think the trend is when they found out they get they have child, they got pregnant, they would try to get married as soon as possible.
Yeah, kind of see it through, I guess.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. I understand you previously studied this phenomenon in Japan.
Right.
Were there any takeaways from that research that you think could be applied to address the declining birth rate here in Taiwan?
So the main takeaway I learned from Japan is that if we consider low birth rate issue as an issue to solve, to resolve, then nothing would help. Because in Japan, we see that low birth rate becomes a really long and consistent and stable phenomenon. In Japan, it remains at around 1.5 for over 40 or 50 years for a very, very long time. So this issue from their experience has been critical for a very long time, and they try to solve this issue by proposing a lot of policy reforms. But also, because I think you know that in many news we are discussing what kind of policy could really help to
fix it. They want to fix it.
Fix this issue. But in Japan's case, they tried a lot of different policies, but it becomes a social trend, actually. It's a stable demographic trend.
When I think about it, my grandma, she had 5 babies.
Yeah.
And my great-grandma, she had 8, or 13, or I don't even remember how many.
Yeah.
And back then, that's just kind of what women did. They didn't really work. They just stayed home and they had babies. So I feel the low birth rate is a natural occurrence in a modernizing society for women who get to do something besides stay home and give birth.
They have more life goal to pursue, essentially. The underlying belief or the concept is still women are the one who should take responsibility for childcare or for the plan to formulate a family. So it's quite a big burden. Like if you want to take on this responsibility, basically need you to like contribute your whole life into there. It's a very big commitment. And as we learn more from education, we know that it costs a lot.
Yes. And we don't get a check, for homemaking.
No. And we don't value that.
No, we don't.
That much. Yeah.
That makes sense. Are there any reasons for the low birth rate that are more specific to just Taiwan?
So some might say like the high cost of living. Compared to Japan, I think this argument is correct because the house price in Japan is relatively affordable.
Okay.
But Korea, we have some kind of a similar situation. We are facing very high house price. The other thing I would say is I think the political environment itself is quite unstable. So people might not be able to foresee their future of raising child in a safe environment. You need to be able to imagine the future to take the first step.
Yeah, the last time I reported on this in the news, it was about how the Taiwanese government is considering making in vitro fertilization, IVF, accessible to unmarried women and lesbian couples. I personally know one unmarried woman in Taiwan who sidestepped this issue by obtaining IVF overseas, and she has twins now. Right. Why do you think these groups haven't been given access to IVF? And do you think allowing Taiwanese women to pursue motherhood independently would have a meaningful impact on the birth rate? Or does it all just kind of go back to not being able to envision a secure future and manifest that?
Answer your first question, I think it's because gay marriage is legalized. So I think after this law passed, people can imagine that more people can have children.
I think that's a good thing, right? To make it available to more groups. It doesn't always just have to be mom and dad.
Yeah, and also when we were trying to like promote or support gay marriage at that time, we did argue that the flexibilization of marriage system itself would contribute to some cultural change. So I think law system change do have cultural impact so that we can start to discuss having child outside of wedlock.
Actually, I think that's very heartening to see the society evolve to meet this need.
I think the first layer we can discuss is whether we wanted to lose this kind of connection between marriage and child rearing, starting by letting single women decide.
You mentioned earlier something about the gender dynamics in Taiwan. When I look at how people talk about the topic of low birth rate on social media, I see a lot of netizens who essentially blame women or they blame men for the low birth rate. It just depends on who's talking. And while this is obviously anecdotal information, I think it speaks to how the current state of gender relations might be having an impact on the birth rate. Have you observed any cultural trends in Taiwan that might indicate a battle between the sexes is a major prohibiting factor for marriage and childbirth?
I think so. When I was traveling to here, I was browsing on threads. And then one post just showed up. But she says, age 20, I don't encourage you to have child. Age 30, I don't encourage you to have child. Age 40, I don't encourage you to have child. And then the following discussion is like, I'm married, but we don't have plan to have child, and we are quite happy about that. And this whole discussion, like this kind of post, frequently showed.
Yeah, and they get a lot of traction because people want to throw their opinion in. They want to talk about this. I think that it comes up in the news so much partly because it attracts clicks. People want to read about it. People have their own preconceived notions about why it's happening, and usually it's based in some bias or prejudice we already hold.
Or they don't think their experience were really discussed.
Yeah,
Or they have more story to share surrounding this whole issue, so they have a lot of things wanted to say.
I have been reading about the 4B movement in South Korea. It's an ultra-feminist movement. The tenets of it are no dating, no marriage, no babies, basically no men, period. Right. And I think this came out of a sort of men versus woman mentality that has emerged in South Korea. And I think although the movement is fringe, this must have some kind of effect on like the social climate.
What you say remind me of a phenomena happened in Japan before. Like we say 草食男. They were saying that younger men, they don't have any intimacy relationship with any woman. And then they don't want to start their own family also. All they wanted to do is just work and then go back home and then lying on the sofa or floor all day. And it's something before, like maybe 10 years ago, was more popular. And we think this is related to the low birth rate issue, is that people are starting to avoid, or they were terrified by the responsibility related to intimacy.
Okay.
And then it affects every level of adulthood.
Right.
And we don't really have, like, we didn't really find a explanation for this. But this is a very important issue we are trying to explore. So come back to Taiwan, we are also see similar trend. People might want to get into romantic relationship. But when this relationship grow into a next level, people might start to try to avoid some kind of discussion within or behind that. If we discuss about the gender dynamic, I think we can like talk about this whole day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the time is limited. But I think the most important thing is that we discuss the concept of autonomy or respect from a very start point, because I think, for example, like Me Too is still, we're still blaming the victim. We are still blaming the victim in Taiwan.
It's still hard to be a woman in general in Taiwan and in the world.
Also, one thing I would like to add is that research in the US, now they found that the educational level do have impact on people's perception on marriage and childbearing. It's a social phenomenon that when women are trying to pursue more knowledge and they learn more, they have some kind of expectation about having a respectful relationship, heterosexual especially, a respect for relationship during their education journeys. They learn more about this, and the expectation just becomes bigger and bigger. And then when they start to join the dating market, which it becomes an issue for them because they feel they have to make it lower.
Compromise.
It really point out a issue here is that some kind of not only knowledge level, but there is a conflict or inconsistency if we say two genders or in the spectrum of gender, then there is a gap here we identified, but it's a really cultural thing. So we still need more time, or it might take like hundreds of years to discuss this. I see the discussion on the internet. A lot of times we are trying to point into others' nose and say,
blame other groups.
You are wrong. But I think the core is we shouldn't go there. If we can create a safe environment to really discuss this thing respectfully between genders, then it might help the cultural thing to change.
It's very idealistic, but I should hope so. We've talked a lot about ways to solve the low birth rate as if it's a problem, but do you think there are any other ways that the underlying issues of a low birth rate society, like the super age society, could be solved that wouldn't involve people having more children?
So Taiwanese government right now is trying to impose some immigration policies to because we said one of the core issue is the lack of labor force. So the global population is still increasing. So countries like us is trying to impose these immigrant policies to compensate the labor force issue. But I think more importantly, it's about a more equal social care system, social welfare system needs to be established. And if the issue is about the care for older people or the generation, then we should come up with not only the policy, but also a drastic social change to address this issue. Like, for example, for myself, it's really hard to discuss this topic with my parents also. Like, when you don't have the ability to decide what kind of life you want to live, then what should we do? This kind of topic is really hard to discuss. So starting from the social welfare system or the policy for elderly care, but also like personally, we need to create an environment to be able to discuss how we want to be cared for.
Thank you very much for coming in and shedding some light on this very complex issue. I definitely learned a lot today.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's news report. Thanks for joining us on air today. Tune in tomorrow for more programs by Radio Taiwan International. And in the meantime, remember to stop scrolling and touch grass. We'll see you next week.